guys! So this is my lecture about logic models. This is pretty brief, but I just wanted to be able to say it out loud for you. It might be a little bit easier for you to interpret what it is that you're supposed to do on the next phase of your projects, your next component basically. And maybe you heard me say things out loud. So the basic logic model, as I believe I said in class, is on page 233. As I said to you, this is as basic as it gets, and I am absolutely fine with you using this logic model. However, there are others within this chapter, patent step 9, that you may find more useful to you. For me personally, this makes the most sense. So when we're talking about logic models, this is what I'm going to refer to. But let's step back for a second and talk about what I mean by logic. So logic in its most basic form is this, right? If A, then B. All right, at some point in your education, you probably heard something along these lines, whether it be a math course or something a little bit more sophisticated. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about logic. The issue, though, is how do we get from A to B, okay? And so that's where the theory of change and the logic model comes in. So there has to be some sort of a causal mechanism in the middle that gets you from A to B. So that's what I'm talking about here, and that's why you need a logic model. The logic model kind of takes that and makes things a little bit more sophisticated, but it's how we get from point A to point B. Okay, so what I want you to do for just a second is go back to, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, or not this past time we met, but the time before, we talked about the bystander education program. That was that article that we read on a college campus where there was a bystander education program to prevent sexual assault against women. And so I want you to think about that particular model, and I want you to think about what it is that was going on there in terms of a logic model. So, in other words, what were they trying to do? Okay, so again, remember that the causal mechanism is the theory of change, and it's how change happens. So what were they trying to do in that bystander education program? Well, there was education, which eventually would lead to, in the minds of the people who created the program, a propensity to intervene if a situation were to arise. Okay? The question is, how do you get there? Again, A, then B. So what's in the middle there? How do we get from A to B? What happens there? So I want you to think about that for just a second and think about what that theory of change would be with regard to the bystander education program. Again, I'm sounding redundant, but that's okay. What's the causal mechanism, right? How are we getting from A to B? So I'm just going to be quiet for a second. I want you to take a second and think about it. Okay. So hopefully you have some ideas in your mind about what that is, all right? In that bystander education program. The way that we get from education to propensity to intervene, I would say, to some extent, hopefully this is something like what you came up with, is some sort of a changed attitude. That's what's happening in the middle. So that's the very, very simplest form of what that theory of change looks like. How do we expand that out into the full logic model, this logic model that's on page 233? Well, the logic model on page 233 has 5 components to it: input, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. All right? So again, I want you to take just a second and think about that bystander education program and think about what each of these might be. And I'll tell you what I think they are. But I want you to kind of give it a minute of thought. What are the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts with regard to that program that gets us from point A, the education, to point B, the propensity to intervene? Maybe you should pause me for a second as you think about it. Okay. And let me just, I'll go back and say here for a second, I should probably have explained each one. The inputs are the resources, all right? What is getting put into the program, what you're using in the program, whatever you have. The activities are what we're asking people to do in the program, okay? The outputs are what service was delivered. This is all in your text as well. The outcomes are the short-term goals of each program, and the impacts are the long-term goals of the program, okay? So again, that being said, what are they for the bystander education program, okay? So a lot of different ways you could look at this. For the bystander education program, I'm just going to tell you what I wrote down. So for the inputs is the program itself, right? That's what you have. You have the educational component there. That's what the input is. That's what they're starting with. The activities are going to be the pre-test, the training scenarios that they use, and the post-tests. The outputs, I would argue, would be the scores on the tests. Okay, so whether people's scores went up or not, that was what they were looking for. That's what they wanted to have happen. That the scores on those tests about education or awareness with regard to sexual assault and domestic violence, that awareness would go up. The outcomes, and also not only awareness but propensity to intervene as they answered those questions on the test. The outcomes would be decreased rape myth acceptance and increased propensity to intervene also. There's a lot of overlap a lot of times between outputs and outcomes. And the idea that they would actually intervene. The impact would be the long-term reduction of sexual violence on campuses, okay, especially on that particular campus where that program happened, right? But the idea would be that by doing this, by increasing that propensity to intervene, you're actually going to long-term decrease sexual violence on campus. So I hope that makes sense of how we get across. So again, taking it from the very simplest, really the very simplest being without the changed attitudes in the middle. Okay, we know that the changed attitudes is the middle part, but then how do we break it down into inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts? All right. So with regard to that, just making sure I'm covering all of this, what we really want to know is to what extent can the outcomes of the program be attributed to the program and how do we get there? So once you have the basics of your model, that A and B, then you need to dig deeper. So think of it with regard to something as simple as, a training program is going to lead to getting a good job, right? That's just one simple example. How do we get there? You need to think about, first of all, how do we operationalize these, right? What's a good job? What kind of a training program? What's happening in that training program? What kind of a job are we going for and what kind of a job are we getting? So a lot of times you'll hear about programs, when we talk about program evaluation, a lot of programs focus on training or education of some sort. And it's the assumption, I want you to think about this for a minute because I know you've heard this before, it's the assumption that knowledge changes behavior. And that's the key piece there, is that knowledge by itself can't change behavior. There has to be that middle part. So if we just, providing information doesn't necessarily fix things, all right? So that's obviously a problem. So I want you to think about some examples of where that doesn't work. A couple of examples I came up with is texting and driving. We talked about that a little bit. We know as a society now that we're all so attached to our cell phones that we're not supposed to text and drive. We know that distracted driving leads to more accidents. Does that necessarily change the behavior? No. Same with drunk driving, right? Anything like that where we know we have lots of information, there's tons of information out there. Does that necessarily change the behavior? Not necessarily. So just because you know something doesn't mean you're going to change behavior. So there has to be that middle piece. So with regard to that, that's what I want you to kind of look at in your program. So, you're all doing lots of different programs. I want you to start with what's being done. What's the input? So what resources do you have in your program that you're evaluating? What are the activities? What's actually being done? Okay. Then go on to what are those outcomes and impacts, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, and go along. So again, don't look at it too simply. Try to flesh it out as much as you can. And by reading Patent Step 9, you'll get a better sense of this. I'm just trying to give you a broad overview. I want you to also think about validity issues, and we didn't talk a lot about validity yet. I know that you did that in your research methods class, but validity is important. What may seem like a very obvious causal connection to you or somebody that's intimately involved with a program may be a validity issue for somebody looking in from the outside. So make sure it's valid. Make sure you're actually looking at what you think you're looking at. All right. Make sure that, like I said, with regard to a good job, for example, what you think of as a good job may not be what somebody else thinks of as a good job. So make sure that you really flesh out what those definitions are so that you don't have any validity issues and you're not looking at something that is invalid. So this is really important that you read step 9 before you try to do this. That's all about the logic models. Then step 10 is all about design and measurement, and that's the next part of that next component that you need to do. The second half of that will be design and measurement. I don't have a lecture for you about that. I need you to just read through and think about what it is that you need to do. I've also handed out some instructions in class. So good luck, and let me know if you have questions.